My name is Nora Kim, and I was 26 years old the morning I sat in my father's lawyer's office and watched him give everything away. Not to me, to my brother, the house, the lake property, the investment accounts my mother had spent 30 years building. Even the grandfather clock that had been in our family for 4 generations. The one I had been told since I was 12 would come to me, because I was the one who learned to wind it, and who polished the brass pendulum, the one who sat beside it when my mother died, and listened to it tick because I couldn't bear the silence. My father, Richard Kim, sat at the head of the conference table in his best suit, and diagnosed with early-stage dementia 8 months earlier. Not so far gone that he couldn't make legal decisions, but far enough that his judgment had softened around the edges, the way wood softens before it rots. My brother Jonathan is right. He was 2 years older than me. He had never once asked how to wind the clock. He had never visited my mother's grave except on the anniversary when our father made him go. He had bounced between jobs for 15 years, real estate and insurance, then something vague involving cryptocurrency that nobody in the family fully understood. And yet, and yet my father was handing him the keys to everything. I sat across the table in a chair that was too low to the ground. The lawyer, a man named Paul Hendricks who had known our family since before I was born, read the will aloud in a voice that grew flatter with every sentence. The house in Evanston, the condo in Florida, the portfolio of stocks my mother had managed personally, the last dividend record, a life insurance policy worth just under $1 million, and the clock, all to Jonathan. I received $10,000, a token, a footnote, and a bequest you leave to a former employee you haven't spoken to in 20 years. When Paul finished reading, I did not cry. I did not stand up. I did not ask the question burning in my throat, which was why. I just sat in that too low chair and looked at my father. He would not meet my eyes. Jonathan, on the other hand, had no such hesitation. He leaned back in his seat, crossed his arms, and said, "Well, that went better than I expected." We flinched. A small thing. A micro movement in his jaw. I saw it, Jonathan did not. Let me tell you about my mother. Grace Kim was not a woman who believed in luck. She believed in spreadsheets. She believed in diversification. And she believed that the stock market was not a casino if you knew which tables to sit at and when to walk away. She started investing when she was 23 years old, working as a secretary at a brokerage firm in Chicago. The men she worked for assumed she was there to take dictation and fetch coffee. She spent her lunch breaks reading their research reports and memorizing ticker symbols and learning, quietly, patiently, how money actually moved. By the time she married my father at 28, she had already turned $15,000 of her own savings into nearly $70,000. My father thought this was charming. A clever hobby for a clever girl. I did not understand what she was building, neither did Jonathan. But I was 12 years old when my mother sat me down at the kitchen table with a stack of annual reports and a calculator. She showed me how to read a balance sheet, how to spot a company that was bleeding cash before the news broke, how to tell the difference between a temporary dip and a permanent decline. Money doesn't care about feelings, she told me. Money cares about math. If you learn the math, the money will follow you. If you don't, it will leave you for someone who did. I took notes in a spiral notebook. I asked questions until she laughed and said I was worse than her old boss. I kept every annual report she gave me in a shoebox under my bed like treasure. Jonathan, meanwhile, was in the basement playing video games. My mother died when I was 18. Pancreatic cancer. Fast. Cruel. Kind of diagnosis that arrives in October and has you picking out a casket by February. She did not leave a will. That was the mistake. The only financial mistake she ever made, and it cost us everything she had tried to protect. Because when she died, everything she owned passed automatically to my father. Not to me, not split between her children. To her husband, by law, by default, by the simple fact that she had been too busy living to think about dying on paper. I loved my mother. I believe that. But love is not the same as competence. And Richard Kim, for all his good qualities, had never learned the math. The 8 years between my mother's death and that lawyer's office were a slow, quiet disaster. He did not sell the investments. He did not manage them. He let them sit untouched. The market rose and fell and rose again, without anyone paying attention to the fees, or the tax implications, or the fact that half the portfolio was allocated to industries that were slowly dying. He also started listening to Jonathan. My brother had failed at every job he'd ever tried, suddenly had very strong opinions about money. He told my father to move funds into safer accounts that paid almost no interest, convinced him to sell a chunk of my mother's best performing stock to pay off Jonathan's credit card debt. $43,000 that disappeared into a black hole of restaurant bills and car payments, and a brief, fated attempt to become a day trader. I watched all of this from a distance. I had graduated college by then. I was working as a junior financial analyst at a small firm downtown. I had my own apartment, my own retirement account, a small portfolio that I had built from nothing using everything my mother taught me. I tried to intervene, gently at first, then more directly. Dad, that stock she bought in '98, it's up 300%. You should hold it, not sell it. That credit card consolidation loan has a 19% interest rate. You're paying them to borrow money you already spent. My father would nod. Jonathan would roll his eyes. Nothing would change. And slowly, I stopped trying. I didn't care. Because I was tired. Because being the only person in a room who understands math doesn't make you right, it makes you exhausting. Because my mother had taught me that money follows math, but she had never taught me what to do when the people you love refuse to do the math at all. So I stepped back. I visited on holidays. I helped my father with his taxes every April, watched from the kitchen doorway as Jonathan led him into decisions that made my stomach turn. And I kept my own books, separate, traceable. Just like my mother had taught me, the diagnosis came on a Tuesday, early stage dementia. I used kinder words, cognitive decline and memory concerns, but I had already seen it coming. My father had been forgetting appointments, losing his train of thought mid-sentence. Looking at the grandfather clock with a blank expression, I wasn't sure why it was there or who had taught him to wind it. Jonathan moved back into the house within a week. He said it was to take care of Dad. And maybe at first, some part of him believed that. But within a month, and had taken over the finances. Within 2, he had convinced my father to add his name to the checking account. Within 3, he had started making withdrawals that had nothing to do with household expenses. I saw the statements, and my father still forwarded them to me, out of habit, even though he couldn't always remember why. I watched a pattern emerge. Withdrawals at odd hours. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. Checks written to people whose names I had never heard. Well, Jonathan. This looks strange, I said. Can you explain these? He laughed. You're still doing that thing where you pretend to care about money more than family. I'm not pretending. I'm asking a question. Dad is fine. I'm handling it. I live 3 hours away. You don't get to swoop in once a quarter and act like you're in charge. He hung up. I sat in my apartment with the bank statements spread across my coffee table. The clock on my wall ticked, a cheap quartz thing, like the grandfather clock in Evanston. And I tried to decide what to do. I could call a lawyer. I could petition for conservatorship. I could try to prove that my father was no longer competent to manage his own affairs. Jonathan was taking advantage of him. That the woman who had taught me to read a balance sheet would never have allowed this to happen to her money. But proving something and winning something are not the same thing. My father still had moments of clarity. Long stretches even, where he was sharp and funny and completely himself. In those moments, he would call me and ask why I didn't visit more often. He would talk about my mother. He would wind the clock himself, literally the way she had taught him. If I tried to take control of his finances, he would hate me. Jonathan would make sure of that, so I waited. I kept the bank statements. I kept the emails. I kept a journal of every concerning conversation and every strange withdrawal, every time Jonathan said something that made my instincts scream. Paper is patience. My mother taught me that too. The off finalized 6 months. Before my father's dementia progressed to the point where he couldn't sign his own name. I wasn't there when he signed it. Neither was Jonathan Lee. The lawyer's office had strict rules about beneficiaries being present during the signing, but Jonathan had driven him there, had sat in the waiting room, had taken him out for lunch afterward, somewhere nice, somewhere my father would have remembered if his memory hadn't already started to blur at the edges. I found out about the will from Paul Hendricks, the family lawyer. He called me 3 days after the signing, which should have been my first warning. Just don't call to deliver good news. Nora, he said, I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it somewhere else. And then he told me everything to Jonathan. The house, the lake property, the investments, the insurance, the clock, everything except $10,000 and a few small personal items my mother had left in a jewelry box. Why? I asked. Paul hesitated. Lawyers are trained to hesitate. It gives them time to decide how much truth the other person can handle. It was very clear that he wanted Jonathan to have the bulk of the estate. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. I hung up. I walked to my kitchen. I filled a glass with water. I did not drink it. I just stood there, holding it. And the light bend through the glass, the way my mother's light used to bend through the crystal decanter. She kept on the sideboard. She had bought that decanter at an estate sale for $12. He had looked up its value later, $250, and she had laughed and said, "See, math follows you everywhere." The decanter was going to Jonathan. Everything was going to Jonathan. And I was standing in my kitchen with a glass of water, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. The reading of the will was not the end, it was the beginning. Because 3 weeks after that morning in Paul Hendricks's office, 3 weeks after my brother leaned back in his chair and said, "That went better than I expected," something happened that changed everything. I received a letter handwritten, cream-colored stationery. The return address was a nursing home 50 miles outside the city, a facility I had never heard of, run by an organization I did not recognize. The letter was from Harold Vance. Harold had been my grandfather's best friend. We had served in the army together, worked at the same manufacturing plant for 30 years, retired within 6 months of each other. Harold had been at every birthday party, every Thanksgiving, every graduation. He had taught me to fish when I was 7, and he had shown me how to tie a proper knot and how to be quiet on the water, and how to tell the difference between a bite and the wind. I had not seen Harold in nearly a decade. After my grandfather died, Harold had drifted. First to Florida, then to Arizona, and to a series of addresses I stopped trying to track. I had assumed he was gone, that he had faded out of our lives the way old friends do when the person who connected them is no longer there. But here was his letter. And in it, 2 sentences that made me drop my coffee mug and watch it shatter on the kitchen floor. "Nora, your father is not the man you think he is. And the inheritance your brother just received? It was never your father's to give." I sat down in the broken glass, did not move for a long time. Then I picked up the letter, brushed off the shards, and read it again. I drove to see Harold the next morning. The nursing home was called Golden Pines. It's the kind of name people choose when they want to soften something that cannot be softened. The building was beige and low-slung, with a circular driveway and a handful of residents in wheelchairs arranged along the front walk like furniture. A man in a pink sweater was talking to a potted fern. A man in a baseball cap was asleep sitting up, his chin on his chest, his hands folded over a newspaper from 3 weeks ago. Harold Vance was in room 117. I found him in a recliner by the window, facing the parking lot. He was 87 years old, which meant he had been 77 the last time I saw him, and the decade between had been unkind. His hair was gone. His skin had the thin, translucent quality of paper held up to light. His hands, the hands that had taught me to tie a fishing knot, were curled on the arms of the chair like empty gloves. But his eyes were still sharp, still watching, calculating in the way that old men calculate when they have spent a lifetime paying attention and have nothing left to lose. "Nora," he said, "you came. You said my father is not who I think he is." I said a lot of things. I gestured to a second chair, a wooden thing with a faded cushion. "Sit down. This is going to take a while." I sat. And Harold Vance told me a story I was not ready to hear. The story began in 1982, 9 years before I was born. My grandfather, Harold's best friend, was a man named Eugene Kim. He had immigrated from South Korea in the 1960s with nothing but a suitcase and a degree in mechanical engineering that nobody in America would recognize. He worked 3 jobs for 7 years. He saved every penny. He bought a small manufacturing plant on the south side of Chicago that was about to go under, and he turned it around by working harder than anyone had a right to work. By 1982, Eugene was wealthy. Not obscenely wealthy, comfortably. He owned the plant, a house in Evanston, a small cabin on a lake in Michigan, and a portfolio of stocks that he managed personally because he didn't trust anyone else to do it. He also had 2 children. My father, Richard, and my aunt, Susan Eugene, loved both of his children, but he did not trust them equally. Your father was always the favorite, Harold said, not because he earned it, because he was the son. Eugene was old school that way. The son gets the business, gets a wedding. That was how he thought. My Aunt Susan had accepted this. She had married a nice man, moved to Ohio, raised 3 children, and never once asked for what was rightfully hers. But my father, Richard, had not accepted the responsibility that came with being the favorite. He was careless, Harold said. Not malicious, just careless. He didn't want to run the plant. He didn't want to manage the money without the work. And Eugene saw that. He saw it clearly, the way fathers see their children's flaws and hope they'll grow out of them. Eugene did not grow out of hoping. He died in 1989, when I was not yet born, and my father was 24 years old. The will was clear. The plant went to my father, the house went to my father, the cabin, the stocks, the investments, all to my father. Aunt Susan received a one-time payment of $50,000 and a set of china. But there was a second document, a secret document. Harold pulled it from a folder he had been keeping in his nightstand for 35 years. The paper was yellowed, edges soft, the typewriter font slightly crooked. It was a letter, written by my grandfather, addressed to Harold. The letter read in part, Harold, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if Richard has lost everything by now, I need you to know. It wasn't his to lose. The plant, the house, the stocks, those were always meant to be held in trust for the grandchildren I haven't met yet. I gave Richard control because I hoped he would grow into it, but I was not a fool. He was. If he proves me right, I want you to tell Nora. Not Jonathan. Nora, she's the one who will understand. Tell her the truth. Tell her the money was never his, it was always hers. I read the letter 3 times, my hands were shaking. Did my father know about this? Harold shook his head. Eugene never told him. He didn't want to undermine Richard's authority. He wanted to give him a chance. But he also wanted a backup plan. That was your grandfather. Always 2 steps ahead. This letter, it's not a legal document. It's just words. It's proof, Harold said. Proof that your grandfather intended something different. Proof that the assets were never meant to be controlled by one person. That your father, he stopped, rubbed his face with those thin, curled hands. Nora, I'm sorry. I should have told you years ago, but I didn't want to cause trouble. I didn't want to be the one who tore your family apart. You're not tearing anything apart, I said. Someone else already did that. I drove back to Chicago in a fog. The letter was in my bag, folded carefully, placed inside a plastic sleeve I had borrowed from the nursing home's front desk, checking to make sure it was still there. Still real. Still the thing that had just rewritten everything I thought I knew about my family. My grandfather had seen it. Decades ago. Before I was born. Before my mother died. My father's dementia and my brother's greed and the will that had handed everything to the wrong person. Eugene Kim had seen what his son was. Careless, entitled, unworthy of the trust placed in him, and he had left a trail, a single letter, with his best friend, waiting for the day someone would need it. That was the part that kept circling back to me as I drove. Not the betrayal, not the injustice, the foresight. My grandfather had known, 35 years ago, this moment might come, and he had prepared for it the way my mother had taught me to prepare, with paper, with documentation, with a record that could not be erased or argued away. Paper is patience. My mother had taught me that. Maybe she had learned it from him. I called a lawyer the next day. Not Paul Hendricks. He was my father's lawyer, which meant he was not my lawyer. I found a woman named Tanya Singh, who specialized in estate litigation. Hello. She had a small office in a building that smelled like old carpet and printer toner. And she listened to my story without interrupting, the same way Deborah had listened in the reference script I had studied, the way good lawyers always listen. Like they are building a case in their head before you finish your first sentence. When I finished, Tanya leaned back in her chair. So let me make sure I understand, she said. Grandfather left a letter indicating that he intended the family assets to be held in trust for future grandchildren, specifically, you. But that letter was never formalized as a legal document, and your father, who inherited everything outright, has now left everything to your brother in his own will. Yes. And your brother is already moving to take possession of the assets. He's been living in the house for months. He's already sold some of the stocks to pay off his credit card debt. He told me he's putting the lake property on the market next week. Tanya nodded slowly. Do you have copies of the bank statements from before your father's diagnosis, before your brother took over the finances? I have everything. Everything? Pulled out my bag, the one I had brought to her office. Inside were copies of every bank statement, every tax return, every email, every handwritten note my father had ever sent me about money. The shoebox from under my bed had transferred to a fireproof file. The journal I had kept of every concerning conversation, the certified copies of my mother's investment records, showing what she had built before she died, and the letter. Tanya read the letter in silence, and she looked up at me with an expression I had not seen before on a lawyer's face. Respect. You came prepared, she said. My mother taught me. Here is what Tanya explained to me. The letter from my grandfather was not a legally binding document, did not override my father's will or transfer ownership of the assets. But it was evidence, powerful evidence. Evidence that my grandfather's intent had been different from what actually happened. Evidence that my father had received the assets under circumstances that my grandfather had explicitly tried to prevent, combined with the bank statements showing my father's financial decline, the mismanagement, the bad investments, the influence of Jonathan. Tanya believed we could make a case, not for the entire estate, but for a portion of it, the portion my grandfather had intended for me, the portion that had been squandered and mismanaged and nearly lost entirely. We're not just fighting your brother's greed, Tanya said. We're fighting your father's incompetence. And we're fighting the clock. Because every day your brother controls those assets, more of them disappear. How much time do we have? Looked at the calendar on her phone. Not enough. So let's get started. The first thing Tanya did was file a motion to freeze the assets. This meant Jonathan could not sell the lake property, could not cash out more stocks, could not transfer money out of the accounts. Everything was paused, frozen in place, while the court decided who had the right to what. Jonathan found out when he tried to list the cabin on a real estate website. The listing went up on a Monday. On Tuesday, the title company had flagged it. By Wednesday, he was on the phone with me, screaming, "What did you do? I hired a lawyer. You're trying to steal Dad's money. I'm trying to protect what Grandpa actually wanted. He's not even dead yet. Dad is still alive. You're fighting over the will of a man who is still breathing." That was true. My father was still alive. Still in the house on Plum Street. No, not Plum Street. The house in Evanston. But I had to keep the details straight. My father was still in Evanston, still in the early stages of dementia, still capable of long conversations about the past, even if he couldn't remember what he had for breakfast. He was not capable of managing his own finances. That was the legal argument. That was the key. If my father had been competent, his will would have stood. He could leave his money to anyone he wanted, including Jonathan, putting a stranger on the street, including a dog. That was his right. But he was not competent, and Tanya believed we could prove that the will had been signed during a period when his cognitive decline had already compromised his judgment. Jonathan had exploited that decline, that the will did not reflect my father's true wishes, because my father at that point could not form true wishes. It was a difficult case. She did not promise me victory. She promised me a fight. I took it. It cost me things I did not expect. Friends who had known my family for years chose sides. Most of them chose Jonathan, because Jonathan had the house and the money and the appearance of being the responsible son. I was the one who had moved away, the one who visited on holidays. I was the one who had, in their eyes, abandoned my father to my brother's care. I did not defend myself. Tanya had told me not to. Every time you explain yourself to someone who already believes his version, and you're just giving his story more air. I had heard that before. In another life, in another story. It was still true, but the silence was lonely. There were nights I sat in my apartment with the grandfather clock I would never inherit. The real one, ticking in Evanston, still marking hours I could not get back, and I wondered if any of it was worth it. The legal fees, the family war, the certainty that even if I won, I would lose something irreplaceable. Then I remembered the letter, which is the one who will understand. My grandfather had believed in me. Before I was born, before I had done anything to earn it, he had looked at the shape of his family and decided that I would be the one to carry the truth. I could not let him down. Could not let him down. The first hearing was 6 weeks after I hired Tanya. Jonathan showed up with a lawyer of his own. A man named Bradley Reese who had the red face and loud voice of someone who had spent decades intimidating people into settling. That the will was valid, that my father had been of sound mind when he signed it, that the letter from my grandfather was irrelevant hearsay, a piece of old paper with no legal standing. Tanya argued back, quietly, precisely, but my mother used to argue about money. She entered the bank statement showing the pattern of withdrawals. She entered the emails where Jonathan had instructed my father to sign documents without reading them. And she entered a report from a geriatric psychiatrist who had reviewed my father's medical records and concluded that his cognitive decline had begun at least a year before the will was signed. And then she entered the letter. Bradley Reese objected. The judge overruled him. I watched Jonathan's face as the letter was read aloud. He had never seen it before. He had never known it existed. And as the words registered, the money was never his. His confident expression cracked, just slightly. An ice cracks when you step on it without knowing how thin it is. He had spent months believing he had won. He had no idea what was coming. The judge did not rule at that first hearing. She said she needed time to review the evidence. The phrase "time to review" is lawyer language for this is complicated and I don't want to make a decision I'll regret. I appreciated her caution, but the waiting was its own kind of torture. Weeks passed. Then months. The assets remained frozen and remained in the house in Evanston because the freeze did not apply to the primary residence. He was living there, sleeping in the bedroom I had grown up in, walking past the grandfather clock every morning on his way to the kitchen. Ida was still there too. In the early stages of dementia, still mobile, still verbal, still capable of long conversations about things that had happened decades ago. But he could not remember what he had eaten for lunch. He could not remember that he had signed a will leaving everything to Jonathan. He could not remember, on his bad days, that my mother was dead. I visited him twice during those months of waiting. The first time, Jonathan was there. He stood in the doorway of the living room with his arms crossed, watching me like I was a burglar. He hadn't decided whether to call the police on. My father sat in his favorite chair, the one by the window, and my mother had bought at an estate sale in 1985 and reupholstered twice. "Hi, Dad," I said. He looked at me. His eyes were cloudy but not empty. There was still someone in there, even if that someone was harder to reach than before. "Nora. When did you get here?" "I just arrived. Your mother is in the kitchen. She's making coffee." I did not correct him. I sat on the ottoman at his feet and took his hand. His skin was dry and warm, the same as it had always been, the same as when he had taught me to ride a bike and walked me to my first day of kindergarten and danced with me at my college graduation. He was still my father. Even if he no longer knew who I was on the days that mattered most. And cleared his throat. "Don't stay too long. He gets tired." I stayed for 2 hours. The second visit was different. Jonathan was not there. He had gone to a deposition. Tanya was deposing him about the timing of the will, conversations with my father, the withdrawals from the accounts. I had arranged to visit while he was gone, because I needed to see my father without my brother's shadow in the room. My father was in the living room again. Same chair, same window. On the wall, the grandfather clock, the one my mother had loved, the one that was supposed to come to me, ticked steadily in the corner. "Dad," I said, "do you remember signing a will?" He looked at me. For a moment, his eyes were clear, completely clear, the way they had been before the diagnosis, before the forgetting, before everything started to blur. "I signed a lot of things," he said. "Jonathan brought me papers. I signed them." "Do you remember what they said?" "No." He frowned. To me, they were for the house, for the taxes. I trusted him. I sat very still. This was not evidence, not legally, not in the way Tanya needed. My father was a witness whose memory could be impeached, statements could be dismissed because of his condition. But it was truth, the kind of truth that doesn't need a courtroom to be real. "He told you to sign papers," I said. "And you signed them. He's my son. He wouldn't." My father stopped. His eyes clouded again, the clarity fading like light at dusk. "What are we talking about?" "Nothing, Dad. It's okay." I stayed until he fell asleep in the chair. Then I walked to the hallway, past the grandfather clock, at photographs of my mother on the wall, past the door to the bedroom where I had slept for 18 years. I did not cry, but I came close. The ruling arrived on a Wednesday. I was at work, My job as a financial analyst that paid my rent and funded my legal fees and reminded me every day that I was not my brother, not my father, not the sum of their mistakes. My phone buzzed with a text from Tanya, call me. I stepped into the conference room and closed the door. Judge ruled in your favor, Tanya said. Not on everything, but on enough. The ruling, she explained, had three parts. First, the judge found that my father lacked testamentary capacity when he signed the will. Evidence, the psychiatrist's report, the bank statements showing the pattern of decline, the testimony from caregivers, was sufficient to prove that he had not understood what he was signing. The will was invalid. Second, the judge ruled that the assets from my grandfather, the original estate that had passed to my father, should be treated as separate property, not marital property, not my father's to distribute freely, because my grandfather's letter, not legally binding, demonstrated an intent that the assets be preserved for future generations, and because my father had received those assets under specific conditions he had failed to meet. Third, the judge ordered a new distribution. The assets would be split equally between Jonathan and me. Not everything, not what my grandfather had intended. But half of the house, half of the lake property, half of the investment accounts my mother had built, of the grandfather clock, which would have to be sold, because you cannot split a clock in half, no matter how much you want to. I sat in the conference room with the phone against my ear and I tried to feel something. Joy, relief, vindication, things you are supposed to feel when you win. But mostly, I felt tired. 10 months of legal fees. 10 months of watching my brother destroy what my mother had built. 10 months of wondering if I was doing the right thing or just the vengeful thing. And now it was over. Congratulations, Tanya said. Thank you, Jonathan's lawyer already called. They're not appealing, he can't afford to. Probably not. There was a pause. Nora, I know this isn't the outcome you wanted, but a good outcome. You should be proud. I was proud. Somewhere, underneath the exhaustion, I was proud, but mostly I was ready to go home. Jonathan moved out of the house 6 weeks later. He did not say goodbye. He did not call. But he packed his things, the things he had brought, the things he had bought with money that was never really his. And he left the keys on the kitchen counter and drove away. I found the keys when I came to clean. The house was a disaster. It is in the sink, clothes on the floor of every bedroom. The grandfather clock stopped. Jonathan had not known how to wind it, or had not cared, and it had been sitting silent for weeks, its pendulum still, its face frozen at 4:47. I wound the clock with both hands and more strength than I expected. The key was in the drawer where it had always been, in the little velvet pouch my mother had sewn for it. I turned it slowly, feeling the mechanism catch and release, until the weight was fully raised and the pendulum could swing again. The clock started ticking. The sound filled the empty house like a heartbeat. I stood in the living room with my hands on the glass face of that clock. The clock that had been in my family for 4 generations. The clock that my grandfather had imported from Korea, that my mother had loved, because it was the only thing in the house that never stopped, never wavered, never forgot what it was supposed to do. And I finally cried. Not because I was sad, because I was home. The lake property sold first, and I agreed on that quickly. Neither of us wanted it. He needed the cash, I needed the closure. The cabin went to a family from Indiana who promised they would keep the dock and the fire pit and the old wooden swing that my mother had hung from the oak tree in 1992. I kept the swing. It was not worth anything. The wood was weathered, the ropes were frayed, and the moving company charged me more to transport it than it would have cost to buy a new one. But I kept it because my mother had sat in that swing with me when I was small, had pushed me back and forth while she read the newspaper, taught me that patience was not passive. It was the thing you did while you waited for the right moment to act. The swing hangs on my back porch now. In the apartment I moved into after the divorce. No, not divorce. After the legal battle, I'd have to keep the story straight in my head. The swing hangs on my back porch. I sit in it sometimes in the evenings, and I listen to the clock ticking in the living room. The grandfather clock, the one I could not split, the one I bought from Jonathan, with half of the proceeds from the lake property. He needed the money. I needed the clock. We both got what we wanted. My father died 18 months after the ruling. Dementia had progressed to the point where he did not recognize me at the end. He did not recognize Jonathan either. He did not recognize the house in Evanston, or the clock in the corner, or the photographs of my mother on the wall. He died in a hospital bed that we set up in the living room because he had always said he wanted to be in the room with the clock when he went. The clock ticked. His breathing slowed. The night nurse came to check on him and found him already gone, hand resting on the arm of the chair where my mother used to sit. I was not there when he died. Jonathan was. That is the part of the story I do not tell often. The part where my brother, the one who had taken everything, manipulated our father, who had tried to cut me out of the inheritance entirely, was the one holding his hand at the end. And I was 3 hours away, stuck in traffic on the interstate, listening to a podcast about nothing, completely unaware that my father was taking his last breath. I do not know if Jonathan stayed because he loved him or because he felt guilty. I do not know if my father knew who was holding his hand. I do not know if any of it mattered in the end. The will, the lawsuit, the frozen assets, the clock, the swing, the letter from my grandfather. What I know is this: when I finally arrived at the hospital, the clock had stopped, not because it was broken, nobody had wounded it. And without the weight of the key, without the patience of the daily ritual, the pendulum had slowed and finally surrendered. I wound it again. It is still ticking. A letter from my grandfather sits in a frame on my desk now, next to the photo of my mother, next to the brass key from the house in Evanston. The key I kept even after we sold the house, even after Jonathan and I split the proceeds, and after the new owners painted the front door a color my mother would have hated. I look at the letter sometimes and I wonder what my grandfather would think if he could see us now. His son, gone. His grandsons, estranged. His granddaughter, sitting in an apartment with a clock that belonged to his father, and a swing that belonged to his daughter-in-law, and a key that belongs to a house he never lived in. Would he be proud of me? Or would he be sad that it came to this? I don't know, but I know what my mother would say. She would say that money is just math, that the numbers don't care about feelings, that the only thing that matters is whether you kept the receipts. I kept the receipts, every one of them. Ask me now if I speak to Jonathan. The answer is no. Not because I hate him. I have spent enough years carrying other people's resentment. I am tired of carrying. I am tired of being the one who holds the weight while everyone else walks away light. I do not speak to him because we have nothing left to say. He wanted what he wanted. I wanted what was right. Those two things could not coexist in the same family, but a same house, in the same room with the same clock ticking in the corner. Maybe one day we will find our way back to each other. Maybe we won't. Either way, I am done being the one who tries. The clock ticks, the swing creaks, the letter stays in its frame, and I keep building the life my mother taught me to build. Separate, traceable, patient, prepared. If you are watching this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you have a brother who took what was yours, a mother who failed to protect you, a mother who taught you everything and then left too soon, I want you to hear something. You are not alone. You are not wrong for fighting back. You are not the villain in this story, no matter how many people tell you otherwise. Keep your paper, keep your receipts, keep the letters and the emails and the bank statements and the journals. Keep everything, because one day you might need it. And even if you don't, even if you walk away clean and never step foot in a courtroom, keeping your own record is an act of love. For the people who believed in you, for the people who are gone, for the person you are becoming. Grandfather believed in me before I was born. My mother taught me the math. My father failed me in every way a father can fail a daughter. And I am still here, the clock is still ticking, and I am still building. My name is Nora Kim. Grandfather left a letter that sat in a nursing home nightstand for 35 years. My brother took everything he could touch, and then my grandfather's best friend told the truth. Noon, if that story made you feel something. If you have been erased by the people who were supposed to love you, if you have been told you are too difficult, too demanding, too much, leave a comment. Tell me your name, tell me what you are building, me, and subscribes because this channel is for women who choose themselves, and I have a feeling you are one of us.